This is the wrong address.
That was the first sentence anyone said to Julian Ashford that morning, spoken by a security guard standing at the gate of the very company Julian had built from nothing, 19 years ago, in a rented office with a leaking ceiling and a single borrowed desk. In exactly 22 minutes, Julian would walk back through that same gate and dismiss the men who said it, standing there in his $3,000 suit with a stillness that unsettled everyone who witnessed it. But to understand how a 47-year-old black man ended up locked outside the walls of his own empire, on the morning of his own board meeting, you have to go back further than that gate. You have to go back to everything that shaped Julian Ashford into the kind of man who never needed to raise his voice to prove exactly who he was. Welcome to the Justice Stories, where betrayal has consequences and justice always has the final word. If you're new here, subscribe, like this video, and join our growing community of justice seekers. Julian Ashford is a kind of man who carries his success the way some men carry an old, familiar coat, present, undeniable but never loud. That morning he arrived in a charcoal suit tailored sharply to his frame, a crisp white shirt open at the collar, a slim leather folder tucked beneath one arm, his hair cut close and silvering at the temples, his face holding the steadiness of a man who had spent decades walking into rooms where people expected him to be anyone but who he actually was. He was 47 years old, and every one of those years lived somewhere in his bearing, not in wrinkles, but in the patience of his jaw, the unhurried rhythm of his stride, the quiet gravity of someone who had learned long ago that dignity requires no one's permission to exist. Colleagues who had worked alongside him for years often described him in remarkably similar terms: measured, exacting, generous with credit but sparing with praise he didn't genuinely believe was earned. He read voraciously, favored long walks over networking dinners whenever his schedule allowed it, and kept, tucked inside his desk drawer at the office, a single photograph of his mother standing outside the print shop that had once housed his very first office, a reminder he glanced at more often than anyone realized. He was not a man who required an audience to feel whole. He required only the quiet, private certainty that he was building something worthy of the sacrifices that had brought him this far. 19 years earlier, Julian had walked into a regional bank in Atlanta carrying a business plan for a supply chain optimization platform that could save mid-size manufacturers millions in wasted freight costs annually. He sat across a lacquered desk from a loan officer who scanned barely 2 pages before sliding the folder back toward him. "It's an interesting concept," the man said, folding his hands with the practiced ease of someone delivering a rejection he delivered 100 times before. "But we typically reserve funding at this level for applicants with a more established track record. Perhaps consider a smaller ask, something more aligned with your current circumstances." Julian sat in his car outside that bank for nearly an hour afterward, not because the rejection had broken him, but because he needed a moment to convert its sting into something usable. He had absorbed some version of that sentence his entire life, from landlords who suddenly discovered an apartment no longer available the instant they saw his face at the door, from a business partner's father who once informed him, at a dinner arranged to celebrate a new venture, that people in your position don't typically end up running things of this scale. Julian never forgot that phrase, "people in your position." He carried it the way you might carry a stone in your pocket, not to feel its weight, but to remember exactly how heavy it once was, so he would never mistake how far he had traveled since. His mother, Corinne, had spent 31 years working her way up from a hospital records clerk to an administrative director in an East Atlanta medical center, raising Julian largely alone after his father left when he was 9. She used to tell him, voice low but unwavering, "Baby, they will make you prove it 100 times before they believe it once. Don't you dare get tired of proving it, and don't you dare let them shrink you while you do." Julian repeated that sentence to himself more times than he could count over the following 2 decades, through failed pitches, through skeptical partners, through a business landscape that consistently required him to demonstrate twice what his competitors demonstrated once. He built Ashford Meridian Logistics anyway, starting with 4 employees crammed into a converted storage room above a print shop, funded initially by a modest loan from a small black-owned credit union 3/4 from that same bank that had turned him away. His first client, a regional furniture distributor on the verge of bankruptcy, took a chance on Julian's unproven platform purely because the owner, a stubborn Georgian named Ruth Callahan, liked the way Julian explained complicated logistics in language her warehouse foreman could actually understand. Ruth used to joke, years later, long after her company had grown 5-fold under Julian's system, that she'd hired him because he was the only consultant who ever bothered talking to my forklift drivers instead of just my accountants. That single contract became the foundation everything else was built upon. Along the way, there had been other figures who mattered, quieter architects of Julian's rise that history books about self-made men so often forget to mention. There was Harold Winslow, a retired logistics executive who mentored Julian in the earliest years, reviewing spreadsheets late into the evening at his kitchen table simply because, as he put it, somebody did it for me once, and I never forgot the debt. There was Marisol Gutierrez, his first hire, who left a stable position at a Fortune 500 firm to join a company that, at the time, existed mostly as a shared vision and a rented photocopier. Julian never forgot the leap of faith each of them had taken on him, and he carried a version of their trust into every decision he made afterward, the way you might carry borrowed courage until you've built enough of your own to spare. 19 years later, Ashford Meridian employed over 6,000 people across 4 continents, and Julian presided over a boardroom overseeing contracts worth billions annually. He had achieved all of it without ever needing headlines to validate what he already privately understood about his own capability. He believed, with something close to religious conviction, in the eventual authority of demonstrated results over assumption. It was a philosophy that had served him extraordinarily well in every arena of business he'd ever entered, and one that was about to be tested more severely than it had been in nearly 2 decades. There had been one other moment, rarely discussed, that Julian sometimes returned to privately when the weight of the world's assumptions grew particularly heavy. In his 11th year running the company, his mother Corinne had suffered a stroke, and Julian had flown home to Atlanta immediately, sitting beside her hospital bed for 11 consecutive days. A young resident physician, unaware of who he was, had once asked him, not unkindly but with an assumption baked so deeply into the question it barely registered as one, whether he was able to cover the costs of his mother's extended care, or whether the hospital's financial assistance office should be looped in. Julian had simply said, without inflection, "I can cover it," and left it there, though later that night, alone in the hallway, he'd allowed himself a rare, exhausted laugh at the absurdity of it all. A man who could have purchased that entire hospital wing twice over, still filtered instinctively through someone else's narrow expectations of what a black son visiting his ailing mother was likely capable of affording. Corinne recovered, slowly, stubbornly, the same way she'd done everything else in her life, and she lived to see her son's company cross its first $1 billion in annual revenue, a milestone she celebrated not with champagne, but with a simple, quiet dinner at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd once told a 9-year-old boy not to let anyone shrink him. Which made it almost unbearably ironic that on an unremarkable Thursday morning, immaculately dressed, chauffeured by his longtime driver Deshaun Miller to the headquarters bearing his own surname carved into the facade, Julian expected nothing more complicated than walking inside and beginning the quarterly board session he himself had scheduled 2 months earlier. The gate, however, had entirely different plans. "Sir, I need you to state your business here," said the man stationed at the checkpoint, a broad, square-jawed employee in his early 30s named Grant Pierce, hired through a private security contractor that had assumed control of gate operations only 8 weeks prior. Julian lowered the rear window of the town car, folder resting across his knee. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock board meeting," Julian said, his tone even unbothered. "Julian Ashford, I should be on today's schedule." Grant consulted a tablet, scrolled, frowned, then lifted his eyes, not toward the tablet again, but toward Julian's face, holding there a beat longer than courtesy required. "I'm not showing Julian Ashford for a board meeting, sir. There's a J. Ashford flagged with executive clearance, but I'll need separate verification for that." "I am the executive in question," Julian replied, his patience intact though something beneath his ribs had already begun tightening. "I founded this company. My name is on the building behind you." Grant actually laughed, not out of cruelty exactly, but with the thoughtless ease of a man who had never once had to prove his belonging anywhere. "I hear that more than you'd think, sir. Everyone becomes somebody important the second they hit this gate. I just need proper verification. Physical badge." "My badge is upstairs with my assistant. I don't typically carry it in the vehicle," Julian said. "Call the executive floor. Ask Renata Acaffer. She'll confirm everything within 30 seconds. "Sir, I can't be phoning every floor in this building every time someone claims to run it," Grant said, an edge slipping now into what had started as procedural indifference. "I'm going to need you to pull the car into that lot while we sort this out." A second employee had joined him by then, heavier, older, arms folded across his chest. A 6-year veteran of the gate named Russ Delaney, a man who considered himself, in his own frequently repeated words, a pretty solid judge of who belonged and who didn't. Russ leaned toward the open window, studied Julian with unhurried scrutiny, and delivered the sentence that would echo through the remainder of that day. "No disrespect intended, sir, but a company worth what this one's worth, that's not usually run by somebody who looks like you. I'm just saying, for your own benefit, maybe you've got the wrong facility." The words landed exactly where they were aimed, whether Russ understood the aim or not, rippling outward through every old wound Julian had spent decades learning to manage. He thought of the lone officer sliding the folder back across the desk. He thought of the apartment suddenly, mysteriously unavailable. He thought of people in your position, spoken now in an entirely different voice, at the gate of the very enterprise that disproved that phrase more thoroughly than any argument ever could. Julian did not raise his voice. He did not open the car door. He simply regarded both men, committed their faces to memory, committed their exact wording to memory, and reached into his jacket for his phone. "You have absolutely no idea what you've just done," he said softly, not a threat, nearly sorrowful. "Sir, I need this vehicle moved," Grant repeated, gesturing toward a side lot, "or I'll have to report this as a disturbance." Julian glanced toward the rearview mirror. "Deshaun, pull us over there, please." His tone never cracked. He began recording discreetly, phone angled toward the windshield, capturing every word that followed, because Julian Ashford understood something the world had taught him repeatedly over 4 decades. Injustice is rarely believed unless it can be presented back to people in their own words, unedited, undeniable. If you've ever been judged before anyone bothered to let you speak, you already understand the particular weight of that moment. Before we continue any further, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because the next 20 minutes of Julian's morning will make your blood boil, and you won't want to miss a single second of what unfolds after it. Here's my question for you, sitting in that car, facing that exact humiliation. Do you think you'd have managed Julian's composure, or would frustration have gotten the better of you? Tell me honestly in the comments below. The car idled in that side lot for 11 full minutes before anyone approached Julian again. And in those 11 minutes, an entirely separate drama was unfolding 200 yards away, inside the glass tower behind that gate. A drama that had nothing whatsoever to do with a missing badge, and everything to do with timing far too convenient to be coincidence. On the 40th floor, 6 board members had already assembled for the scheduled session, laptops open, coffee cooling, waiting on the man whose surname was etched into the building's facade. Among them sat Preston Hale, a board member of 5 years who had, over recent months, grown increasingly vocal in private conversations about what he termed leadership stability concerns. Preston had never fully warmed to Julian's understated style, his preference for substance over spectacle, results over reassurance. To Preston, that reserved confidence had always registered as something closer to detachment, though he rarely voiced the suspicion outright. What Preston did not yet realize, and what Julian himself had not yet confirmed, was that Preston had spent nearly 2 months discreetly cultivating support among 3 other board members, floating the idea that Ashford Meridian required a more visible, more accessible presence at its helm. "He's late," Preston observed, checking his watch as the clock crept past 10 past the hour. Again. "He's never late," countered Renata Ackafer, Julian's longtime executive assistant, seated near the head of the table, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had worked alongside a man for 12 years and understood his habits better than his own relatives did. "Something's happened." "Or something's finally caught up with him," Preston murmured, barely audible, and 2 of the newer board members traded a glance that made Renata's stomach clench. Preston Hale had joined the board through an entirely different route than most of his colleagues. Inheriting his seat after his father's investment firm, had taken an early minority stake in Ashford Meridian back, when the company was still considered a risky bet by most institutional standards. He had spent much of his career comfortably positioned inside rooms he hadn't necessarily earned his way into, and something about Julian's trajectory, rising from nothing methodically, without the safety net Preston had always taken for granted, unsettled him in ways he rarely examined too closely. He told himself his concerns were purely strategic, purely about optics and shareholder confidence, and perhaps in some limited sense they were. But underneath the language of governance and stability lived something less flattering, an unexamined discomfort with a leader who owed his position to nobody's inheritance but his own persistence. A younger board member, Camille Whitfield, glanced uneasily between Preston and Renata, sensing the friction but unsure yet which side of it deserved her attention. She had joined the board only 14 months earlier, brought in specifically to modernize the company's governance practices, and she had privately admired Julian's leadership style from a respectful distance, though she'd said little of substance in these meetings so far, still finding her footing among colleagues considerably more senior than herself. It was in that precise instant that Renata's phone buzzed with a message from Deshaun Miller, 4 words that drained the color from her face. "They won't let him in." She rose immediately, chair scraping backward against the floor. "Excuse me," she said, and walked out of that boardroom without pausing to seek anyone's permission. Meanwhile, at the checkpoint, Julian remained seated in the rear of the town car, phone recording intermittently, watching Grant and Russ confer near the guard booth, their eyes occasionally drifting back toward the vehicle with the particular wariness of men beginning to suspect, somewhere beneath their bravado, that they had overcommitted to an error too far along to reverse gracefully. A third employee stood nearby, much younger, a recent hire named Tobias Reyes, shifting his weight uneasily from foot to foot. "Guys," Tobias ventured, his voice low, glancing at the tablet in Grant's hands. "I actually think that might be him. There was a photo in the orientation packet, a founder's welcome message with his picture at the top." "Kid, relax," Russ said, waving him off without so much as glancing at the tablet. "You've been here 2 weeks. I've done this 6 years. Trust me, I've seen this exact move a dozen times. Somebody dresses sharp, talks confident, figures that'll get them past us. Half of them are scouting the place. The other half just want 5 minutes of feeling important." Tobias fell quiet, though his gaze kept drifting back toward the car, unsettled by an instinct his short tenure hadn't yet taught him to trust over his supervisor's certainty. He had taken this position only 2 weeks earlier, having relocated from a smaller city specifically for the opportunity, proud simply to have landed work at a company as respected as Ashford Meridian. He didn't want to be the new hire who caused a scene on his second week, didn't want to be labeled difficult or presumptuous before he'd even had a chance to prove his reliability. So he stood there, torn between the quiet certainty gathering in his gut and the louder, more immediate pressure of not wanting to embarrass himself in front of men who'd been doing this job for years. It was a tension he would think about for a long time afterward, the way ordinary caution can sometimes calcify into complicity if nobody ever pushes back against it. Julian, meanwhile, sat with a stillness that would have alarmed anyone paying close attention. He was not frightened. He was documenting. This was not the first occasion in his career resembling this shape, though never quite this exact configuration. 2 years earlier, at a hotel in which he held a controlling ownership stake, a night manager had refused to honor his reservation, insisting the presidential suite must have been booked under someone else entirely. 4 years before that, a valet at an industry conference had pressed a set of keys into his palm and asked him to retrieve the black sedan, mistaking him, in a ballroom filled with 500 executives, for hired staff. Each incident he had absorbed with restraint, corrected firmly, and set aside, believing that reacting loudly to any single moment would accomplish nothing against the deeper current running beneath it all. But sitting there, phone recording, gate looming ahead like a barrier constructed from his own capital, Julian arrived at a different decision. He was finished absorbing it in silence. He thought again of his mother's words, worn smooth from repetition over decades, and he thought too of something else, a memory surfacing unbidden from his second year running the company, when an investor had pulled him aside after a pitch meeting and told him, not unkindly but with unmistakable condescension, "You're impressive for someone who started where you started." Julian had smiled that day, thanked the man for his time, and closed the round without him. He had learned, gradually, that the sharpest response to underestimation was rarely confrontation. It was simply continuing to build, undeterred, until the underestimation collapsed under its own weight. There was also Harold Onsla's voice, the retired executive who had mentored him in those earliest years, now long retired to a quiet life outside Savannah. Harold had once told him, over a late dinner following a particularly brutal quarter, "Julian, the world will keep handing you smaller boxes than you deserve. Your job isn't to argue with the box. Your job is to keep growing until the box itself becomes the joke." Julian had carried that advice through hostile board disputes, through supply chain crises that nearly bankrupted the company in its 7th year, through every quiet slight he'd absorbed at conferences and negotiating tables across 2 decades. But sitting at that gate, watching Russ Dullana's smug, unbothered posture through the windshield, Julian understood, perhaps for the first time in years, that some boxes needed to be named publicly before they could ever truly become a joke. Silence had built his company. It was not, he now realized, going to be what protected the people coming up behind him. But some mornings demanded more than continued building. Some mornings demanded that the weight collapse in full view of everyone standing near it. His phone buzzed. A message from Renata: "I'm coming down. Stay exactly where you are. I've got this handled." He typed back 5 words. "Bring your executive badge, please." Renata Ukifke crossed the marble lobby at a pace bordering on a run, heels striking sharply against the polished floor, executive badge already raised, phone pressed against her ear as she rapidly briefed the building's head of operations. She had worked alongside Julian Ashford for 12 years, had watched him assemble entire divisions from single late-night conversations, had sat beside him through hostile acquisition attempts and volatile market downturns that would have unraveled lesser executives, and in 12 years, she had never once witnessed him raise his voice in anger. Which was exactly why the measured tone of his final message, "Bring your executive badge, please," unsettled her far more than capital letters ever could have. She reached the checkpoint within 4 minutes, badge already extended before she'd fully stopped moving. "Grant, Russ, stand down immediately," she announced, her voice carrying the command of a woman who had spent over a decade mastering how to control a room without ever needing volume. "That is Julian Ashford, founder and chief executive of this company. You have detained him for nearly 20 minutes. Grant's expression underwent a rapid, visible collapse, confidence draining away in real time, replaced by the specific horror of a man realizing, all at once, the complete magnitude of his error. Russ, whether from residual stubbornness or genuine confusion, still hesitated, glancing between Renata's badge, the car, and Julian's composed, unreadable bearing. "Ma'am, I still need to verify," Russ began. "You need to raise this gate," Renata interrupted, her tone brooking no negotiation whatsoever, "before I personally ensure this incident reaches every board member's desk before that meeting even convenes." The barrier was lifted. Julian stepped from the car, buttoned his jacket in a single unhurried motion, and walked past both men without a glance in their direction, not from cruelty, but because he intended to reserve every ounce of what remained unsaid for a room where it would actually carry consequence. Before crossing the threshold, however, he paused, turned, fixed his gaze directly on Russ Dullana, the man who had informed him, no disrespect intended, that a company of this size wasn't typically run by someone who looked like him. "I want you both in the executive conference room in 15 minutes, Julian said, his tone perfectly level. "Not yet to be dismissed, to listen. You're going to want to hear exactly what I have to say before this concludes." Upstairs, tension had thickened considerably in Julian's absence. Preston Hale had used the delay to further needle 2 board members, subtly suggesting that a man incapable of managing his own arrival to a meeting perhaps couldn't be trusted managing a multi-billion-dollar enterprise either. It was, Preston believed, just the kind of small fracture he needed to widen his coalition further. What Preston failed to grasp was that he was about to watch that fracture seal shut permanently, in front of his own eyes. Meanwhile, word of the incident had already begun spreading through the building itself, the way these things inevitably do, regardless of how contained anyone intends them to remain. A junior analyst on the 12th floor, who happened to be parking nearby when the confrontation unfolded, mentioned it in passing to a colleague over coffee. That colleague mentioned it to someone in marketing. Within 40 minutes, a hushed, half-formed version of the story had reached nearly every floor of the building, distorted slightly with each retelling, but carrying, underneath the distortion, an unmistakable current of outrage. Several employees, unprompted, began jotting down their own recollections of the morning, uncertain yet what any of it would eventually mean, but sensing, correctly, that they were witnessing something the company would be discussing for considerably longer than a single afternoon. Julian entered the boardroom 18 minutes past schedule, jacket buttoned, expression composed, Renata a half-step behind him, and the entire room fell into that particular hush that settles when everyone present senses, without being told directly, that something consequential has just transpired. "My apologies for the delay," Julian said, settling into his seat at the head of the table, placing his phone deliberately face-up before him. A paused frame frozen on the screen, Russ Dullana's face, mid-sentence, captured in the exact instant he'd suggested Julian didn't belong. "I was detained at our own front gate for 19 minutes by 2 members of our security personnel, who informed me, quoting them directly, that a company of this scale and value wasn't typically run by somebody who looked like me." The hush in that room deepened into something almost tangible. Preston Hale's mouth parted slightly, then closed again, no words emerging. 2 junior board members exchanged a glance loaded with visible unease. Renata remained standing near the entrance, arms folded, observing. "I want to be entirely clear about something before we proceed to today's agenda," Julian continued, his voice never climbing, never faltering, carrying instead a controlled gravity that filled the space more thoroughly than raised volume ever could. This is not the first occasion something resembling this has happened to me. Not identically, but similar enough in shape that I've stopped attributing it to coincidence. A hotel reservation denied under my own name, 2 years past. A valet mistaking me for staff at a conference where I delivered the keynote address. Small moments individually, moments some among you might be inclined to dismiss as isolated. But I have carried each one, and this morning, at the gate of my own company, on the day of my own scheduled meeting, I decided I was finished carrying them silently. One of the older board members, a soft-spoken finance veteran named Walter Kim who had served alongside Julian since the company's very first public offering, cleared his throat and spoke for the first time that morning. "Julian, I want you to know, speaking only for myself, that this is a disgrace, and it deserves far more than a quiet conversation behind closed doors." Julian nodded once toward him, a small but genuine acknowledgement before continuing. "I appreciate that, Walter. But I didn't call this meeting to collect sympathy," Julian said. "I called it, originally, to discuss next year's expansion into 3 new regional markets. I still intend to discuss that today because this company does not stop building simply because I was made to feel, for 19 minutes, like I didn't belong inside it. But before we discuss expansion, we are going to discuss exactly what happened this morning, in full, because I refuse to let it be quietly absorbed into the background noise of an ordinary Thursday. If you've ever been diminished in a room you had every right to occupy fully, this next section is written for you, and I need you to hit subscribe right now, because what Julian says next transforms this entire narrative from injustice into reckoning. Julian allowed the silence in that boardroom to extend long enough that nobody dared interrupt it. And when he finally resumed speaking, every word carried the accumulated weight of 19 years behind it. "I built this company starting with 4 employees and 1 client willing to take a chance on a young black man practically nobody else believed in," he said, sweeping his gaze slowly around the table, holding each board member's eyes in turn. "I have sat across desks from men who returned my business proposals without reading past the second page. I have been told, more times than deserves counting, that people in my position don't typically end up running enterprises like this. And this morning, at my own gate, on my own property, I was told the same message again, this time by 2 men employed specifically to safeguard this building, this company, and by extension, me." He turned his attention toward Preston Hale, whose earlier bravado had completely dissolved. "Preston, I understand you've harbored concerns about my visibility as a leader, about my accessibility. I've heard about the conversations you've been conducting with certain members of this board over these past 2 months, floating the idea, carefully and out of earshot, that it might be time for a change at the top." A genuine flicker of shock crossed Preston's expression, the dawning realization that Julian had known about the entire coalition all along, had simply chosen, with the same patience defining everything he undertook, to wait for the most consequential moment to address it. "I'd like you to sit with the irony of this particular morning, Preston. The very incident you might have used as evidence of my supposed unreliability was caused, start to finish, by 2 men who couldn't reconcile a black man arriving punctually, dressed appropriately, for his own scheduled board meeting, with the truth of who he actually was." Preston offered no response. There was nothing remaining to say. Julian rose, crossed to the window overlooking the skyline his enterprise had helped construct, then turned back toward the assembled room. "I have no interest in indicting this entire company over the actions of 2 individuals stationed at a gate. But I am equally uninterested in pretending this represented merely an isolated oversight, a badge slipping through administrative cracks, an unfortunate misunderstanding easily resolved. This was an assumption, deeply entrenched, that achievement and black identity cannot occupy the same sentence, and I refuse, At 47 years of age, having constructed everything standing behind me, to let that assumption pass unanswered inside the very building that stands as living proof of exactly how mistaken it is. He summoned Grant Pierce and Russ Delaney into the room precisely 15 minutes later, as promised. Both men stood near the entrance, Grant visibly trembling, Russ attempting, with considerably less success, to salvage some remnant of the composure that had failed him so completely at the gate. "I want you to understand something before I proceed further," Julian told them, his voice measured, nearly gentle, though every syllable carried unmistakable finality. "This situation isn't fundamentally about either of you as individuals. You represent a symptom of something considerably larger, an assumption embedded so deeply that men can hold positions guarding the entrances of a company like this, and still, without a second thought, conclude its own founder doesn't belong within it because of his complexion. That assumption cost this company something today more valuable than currency. It cost an employee watching from the periphery who could perceive clearly what neither of you could. A young man named Tobias, who attempted to warn you, and whom you dismissed because you had already convinced yourselves you understood better." Russ's jaw tightened, though he offered nothing in reply. "I am terminating both of your contracts, effective immediately," Julian continued. "Not out of vindictiveness, and not because I believe either of you woke this morning intending cruelty, but because the standard governing who protects the people and property of this enterprise cannot include the assumption that achievement possesses a complexion, or that a person's worth can be gauged by their appearance stepping from a vehicle. Success has no color. It never has. What it possesses, invariably, is patience and evidence, and people determined to build long after everyone surrounding them has decided they cannot." Grant departed without uttering a word, his shoulders sagging beneath the visible weight of consequence finally landing. Russ lingered at the doorway a moment longer, glanced back once, and said quietly, "I'm sorry, sir. Genuinely." Julian nodded once, not precisely forgiveness, but acknowledgement, the recognition that even a belated apology carries more weight than silence ever could. "I believe you," Julian said. "But belief and consequence aren't the same thing, Russ. You can be sorry and it can still be over. Those two truths exist together far more often than people like to admit." Russ said nothing further, simply turned and walked out, and Julian stood alone in the room for a long moment afterward, exhaling slowly, allowing himself, finally in privacy, a fraction of the exhaustion he had refused to display all morning. Renata, watching from the doorway, said nothing either, understanding instinctively that some moments require witness rather than words. Later that afternoon, Julian met privately with Tobias Reyes, the young security employee who had tried unsuccessfully to intervene. "You saw it," Julian told him simply, "before either of your supervisors did. That matters more than you probably realize right now." Tobias, still visibly shaken by the morning's events, admitted quietly that he'd nearly said nothing at all, worried about overstepping in only his second week on the job. "That fear is exactly what allows moments like this to keep happening," Julian said. "I'm not interested in punishing you for hesitating. I'm interested in making sure the next time your instincts tell you something is wrong, this company has built enough trust that you'll act on them immediately, without fear of consequence for speaking up." It was, though neither of them fully realized it yet, the first quiet seed of the accountability structure Julian would formally announce 3 days later. The dismissal reached the security contractor's regional office within the hour, and by that same afternoon, the contractor's leadership had launched an internal review of hearing and training protocols across every property they serviced, uncomfortably aware that this incident, left unaddressed, threatened contracts far beyond Ashford Meridian alone. The contractor's chief executive, a man named Walter Prout, personally called Julian later that evening, stammering through an apology that oscillated uncomfortably between genuine contrition and defensive damage control. Julian listened patiently, then said simply, "I don't need your apology, Walter. I need your entire company retrained, and I need proof of it within 90 days, or we terminate this contract across all 4 continents." Prude agreed immediately, and within a week, an independent auditor had been retained to verify that the retraining wasn't merely cosmetic, but substantive and measurable. Renata, along with the company's head of communications, spent that same afternoon fielding an unexpected surge of inquiries from local business journalists who had somehow already gotten wind of the incident, likely from the same rippling grapevine that had spread it through the building itself. Julian made a deliberate decision not to suppress the story, nor to have it managed behind closed doors through a sanitized corporate statement. Instead, he authorized a single, direct interview with a respected local business reporter, insisting on only one condition: that the piece include not just his account of the morning, but the broader pattern of smaller indignities he had endured across his career, so that the story would resonate as something larger than an isolated inconvenience for one wealthy man. 3 days afterward, Julian Ashford stood in the atrium of Ashford Meridian's headquarters, the very building where he had been turned away at its own gate, addressing every employee gathered on short notice, alongside a live stream reaching regional offices across 4 continents. He wore the identical charcoal suit he'd worn that gate-side morning, deliberately, because he wanted everyone watching to witness exactly what he had looked like when 2 men decided he didn't belong. 3 days ago, Julian began, his voice carrying clearly across the atrium's expanse, I was denied entrance to this building, the building housing 19 years of my life's work, because 2 men stationed at our gate could not reconcile what achievement is supposed to resemble with what I actually resemble. I intend to address that honestly today, not as some private matter settled behind the scenes and forgotten, but as something this entire organization must reckon with collectively. He unveiled 3 initiatives that afternoon, each deliberate, each engineered to outlast whatever news cycle this incident would inevitably generate. First, every security employee across every Ashford Meridian property would undergo mandatory, recurring bias awareness instruction, developed alongside an external organization specializing in workplace discrimination, reviewed and renewed annually without exception. Second, an independent ethics and accountability channel would be established, reporting directly to the board rather than any single executive, ensuring that any employee witnessing an injustice, the way Tobias Reyes had witnessed one that morning, would never again feel powerless to intervene. Tobias himself received a promotion within the month into a newly created junior compliance position, specifically because he had attempted, against the doubt of colleagues more senior, to do what was right. Third, and most personally significant, Julian announced establishment of the Ashford Foundation for First-Generation Founders, a fund dedicated to supplying capital and mentorship to entrepreneurs, particularly entrepreneurs of color, who had been rejected by conventional lenders exactly as Julian himself had been rejected 19 years earlier, sitting in a parked car outside a bank in Atlanta with a business plan nobody had believed in. I did not construct this company merely so that I would personally never again encounter an assumption like the one I encountered at our own gate, Julian told the assembled crowd, his voice steady, unshaken, carrying the calm of a man who had finally articulated everything he had spent a lifetime holding inside himself. I constructed this company because I refused to permit that assumption to define what was possible for me. And I'm telling all of you this today because I refuse to let it define what's possible within these walls, for anyone, ever again. He paused, surveying the gathered crowd, and delivered the sentence that would subsequently appear quoted across business publications, repeated within leadership seminars, and remembered by every employee present that day for the remainder of their careers. Success has no color. It never has and it never will. What it has, invariably, is patience, evidence, and the refusal to permit anyone else the authority to determine what you're capable of becoming. The response inside the company was immediate and layered. Some employees, particularly those who had themselves weathered similar dismissals over the years, assumptions about accents, about names, about which neighborhoods they'd grown up in, approached Julian privately in the weeks following, sharing their own quieter versions of that same gateside morning. Renata Akafer began compiling those accounts, with permission, into what eventually became an internal case study series used throughout the new bias awareness training, ensuring Julian's experience became not merely a singular anecdote, but a catalyst illuminating a much wider pattern many had endured without ever having language or platform to name it. Preston Hale, for his part, remained on the board, though something in his posture shifted permanently after that meeting. Whether from genuine reflection or simple self-preservation, he never again floated language about accessibility or visibility. And within a year he had become, somewhat unexpectedly, one of the loudest internal advocates for the ethics reporting channel Julian had established, perhaps recognizing that his own quiet maneuvering had been examined and understood far more thoroughly than he'd ever imagined. Grant Pierce, several months later, reached out through a mutual contact requesting a conversation with Julian directly, not seeking reinstatement, but seeking, in his words, to actually understand what I did, rather than just knowing I got fired for it. Julian agreed to the conversation, a brief, uncomfortable, necessary exchange that ended not with reconciliation exactly, but with something adjacent to it. Grant enrolling, independently and at his own expense, in a community diversity training program, motivated by a discomfort he couldn't entirely shake. Russ Delaney, by contrast, never reached out at all, and Julian, when asked about it by a journalist months later, simply said, "Not everyone uses a mirror the same way. Some people look into it. Some people just keep walking past it. I can only control what happens on my side of that gate." 6 months following that morning, the Ashford Foundation had funded its first 14 small businesses, each founded by entrepreneurs previously denied traditional funding at least once before discovering Julian's initiative. One of those recipients, a young woman named Adiz Nwasu building a cold chain delivery startup for rural pharmacies, later described her first meeting with Julian as the first time in 3 years anyone with real money asked me about my logistics model before asking about my collateral. Her company, still in its infancy, had already begun delivering critical medication to communities that had previously gone without reliable access, a ripple effect Julian rarely mentioned publicly, but privately considered among the proudest outcomes of that entire ordeal. Tobias Reyes had become one of the most respected voices within the company's expanding compliance division, frequently telling incoming hires honestly about the morning he'd tried, and initially failed, to speak decisively enough, and how that near failure ultimately taught him never to hesitate again when instinct told him something was wrong. Camille Whitfield, the younger board member who had watched that fraught morning meeting unfold largely in silence, later became the board's most consistent champion of the new ethics reporting channel, crediting the experience with teaching her that governance required courage as much as competence. Deshaun Miller, Julian's driver, later remarked in an internal company profile that he'd never once seen Julian's composure crack that morning, not because he wasn't furious, but because he'd learned a long time ago that fury needs a destination to actually matter, and he was busy finding the right one. Marisol Gutierrez, Julian's very first hire nearly 2 decades earlier, now running the company's entire operations division, told a reporter around the same time that the gate incident hadn't surprised her in the slightest. "People have been underestimating Julian since the day I met him," she said. "The only difference is that this time, the whole world got to watch him prove them wrong in real time." Renata Akafer, reflecting on the entire episode nearly a year afterward, told a colleague that what struck her most wasn't the injustice of that Thursday morning itself, painful as it had been, but rather what Julian chose to build in its aftermath. Plenty of powerful people get to have their dignity restored after something like this happens to them, she said. Far fewer of them use that moment to make sure it happens less often to everybody else. The Ashford Foundation, in its second year, expanded beyond small business, lending into a formal mentorship pipeline, pairing seasoned executives across the industry with first-generation founders, navigating exactly the kind of doubt and dismissal Julian himself had weathered 2 decades earlier. The gate itself was rebuilt within the year, not out of any strict operational necessity, but because Julian wanted something small and symbolic to mark the change. A modest brass plaque now sits beside the checkpoint, inscribed with a single sentence, visible to every employee, contractor, and visitor who passes beneath it each morning. Success has no color. It asks nothing of anyone reading it except to remember. And for the men and women stationed at that gate today, trained now to verify identity through evidence rather than assumption, it has become less a slogan and more a quiet, daily accountability. And Julian Ashford still arrived at that same gate every single morning, in the same tailored suits, now greeted by an entirely reconstituted security team who recognized him immediately, not because of any badge or photograph on file, but because the company he'd constructed, and the man he had always been beneath every assumption ever leveled against him, had finally been perceived clearly for exactly what it was. If this story moved you even half as profoundly as it moved me while telling it, don't scroll past without hitting that subscribe button, because narratives exactly like this one are the entire reason this channel exists, and there are countless more waiting for you. And I want to leave you with one final question before you go. Have you ever had to prove your worth to somebody who judged you before you'd even spoken a single word? And if so, how did you ultimately respond? Share your story in the comments below, because I read every single one, and yours might be precisely what someone else needs to encounter today.